welcome to Fireside Chats. I'm Jordan, this is Alex, and we've got some other people.
Hi, I'm other people.
This is Ricky Chapman. First thing that comes to mind when we say transportation.
Aviation.
Aviation?
Ships.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. What about you?
Same thing, maritime. Railway. The amount of railway in this country is ridiculous.
Yeah, so you've been doing some research this morning on just railway, other things too, but railway enough, alone. Has it shocked you the amount of railways that you realize we still use in this country?
So I'll tell you a couple things that I learned today. So of the millions of miles of rail that we have within the United States, all rail is not equal. There's commuter rail, there's passenger rail, there's rail that's specific to, say, cargo, right? And then the priorities of track usage. That was interesting to me. So passenger train takes priority over all of the other logistic train. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Also, the speed of which you can travel on certain rail changes depending on where you are, depending on the composition of track that you're on. And I thought that was really interesting. And for the millions of miles of track that we have, there's only really 3 or 4 major railroad companies in the United States. And I thought that was kind of interesting to see how the U.S. uses rail. So pretty cool.
Wild. And
it's interesting on top of that, right? The Northeast Corridor is a heavily populated area. And that's where the most commuter rail goes through, right? Basically Boston down to DC. And so there's millions of people every year traveling on that. The thing I find interesting about rail though is how connected it is with every other transportation sector that we do in the United States, right? A rail line is always going to end at either a shipyard, or it might stop at an airport, or it might stop at truck yards, right? So it's connected everywhere as well.
Yeah, a great example of that is right here in Maryland. You can hop on a train from certain little locations, or one of the little commuter rails, or even a bus to get you to the train, and then take the train to a location, and then, for instance, maybe come back to that same route. You'll end up back at BWI at the airport, and then have to take another port of transportation model somewhere else around Maryland. But yeah, it's train connects us a lot of different ways, and all the other different types of transportation.
100%, man. And something of interest, the railway system is also used for military purposes. It's to move military equipment from their duty stations to a port of call outward, right? And so it was interesting researching the strategic ports around the country and how trains, the train tracks, how they relate to those strategic ports. And so out on our west and east coast, our strategic ports that we use to move military equipment overseas. And really, largely, the only way you get there is by rail. What would it take to put a tank on an aircraft? That would be a little cumbersome. So you have to do it through railway. And I would imagine, I'm not an expert, but I'd imagine that during times of natural disaster and or high priority for Department of Defense, they would get priority on the tracks that they need to get that equipment through. So I just thought it was really interesting to see how many miles of track we have, the types of track, what is it used for, and then how does our transportation system connect? That's what's fascinating to me. We're moving things land, air, sea constantly. And now with SpaceX, we're in the space now, so people are going to Mars. I like that a lot too.
The thing that kills me about the train track thing is, you remember living in Columbia, South Carolina, and having to sit once, maybe a month, you'd get stuck by that morning train.
Oh, yeah.
And it would probably only be about 30 cars long, but it would feel like 120 cars long. And technically that means that train then takes priority. Even if it's non-commuter, right? It wasn't commuter rail, it was transporting goods, coal, whatever it was transporting. That took priority over us in our cars getting to work. So, because it would stop traffic for 30, 45 minutes, be stuck there. So
it's interesting that we don't hear a lot about trains unless there's an accident.
Yeah, a derailment.
There was actually a derailment in Memphis, Tennessee
Today.
Today.
Oh, wow.
There's a derailment, but that's something that's interesting, right? Is we've heard recently about a lot of derailments that have happened in the U.S., right? Because our infrastructure is old, right? Our rail infrastructure is old. There's not a lot of money going towards it. But it makes me think, right? Those derailments were all physical, right? A train hop track went off, right? But if the rail infrastructure itself that the trains run on every day is old, what is the technology that these trains are running on? What is the system? What are the systems that these trains are running on? And what risks do those have, right? How many CVEs exist for those, right? What is the risk that poses if these systems are out of date?
Is it even, and you guys are doing the majority of the research here, but is it even enough technology on a train right now, commuter or otherwise, right, that would even matter to be messed with right now? Or would you just like pop, part of the track somewhere and that would derail the train, and you don't have to do, it could be a purely physical attack because it's not advanced enough to be a technical attack.
So I think where the issue comes, right, is not the trains themselves, but the switches, right? Okay. If you are sitting there and you now have access on a switch, you can send that train elsewhere. You can send it to a different location.
Yeet.
And now, you just send it elsewhere.
That's terrifying.
And that train is now in a different location. It's stuck on whatever track it is, right? Or all these trains, they have control centers. There are probably multiple control, like aviation. The FAA has like multiple regional control centers, right? There's probably that for trains as well. You shut down one of those, that whole center, that whole section of switches and controls is all down. You have trains that are kind of just like stuck out there because trains are in the middle of nowhere, right? Like these tracks go anywhere. There may be cell service, there may not be, right? And like if you lose contact with that train, there's this heavy moving object that is just stuck out there or going without anyone knowing where it is, right? So maybe you shut down a train, maybe you like move rail, like that's that physical. But if you can take over those switches, if you can get into the systems, you can shut everything down.
I bet they also don't do the greatest job of building in that redundancy to say, okay, like, well, you're offline, so you're next. You're up, bud. Figure it out.
Well, so we've actually seen some really, for the Russia-Ukraine war, right? Some anti-war Russians have actually gone in and burned train control panels that are just sitting by railroads, right? Like that's a physical attack, but that shut down that entire line.
Wow.
Because if you look at like a railroad, there are all these boxes around them. Those are just all the switches. Those are the electronics. You take those out, you've taken out that line.
And speaking of redundancy, redundancy for train infrastructure is not the same as, say, network infrastructure or roadways. In order for a train track to be redundant, it may be hundreds of miles out of the way to get that train back going in the right direction.
Because you can't just turn a train around.
No, definitely not. Yeah. Definitely not. And so while there's so much about the physical aspects of affecting trains, the signaling would be, I think, the biggest piece to that. And if you wanted more of a logical or a cyber effect, I think signaling would make sense. But then there's also, jamming. Trains also use GPS. There's also some automated controls that determine speed for the train as well. As I mentioned earlier, there are certain tracks that are rated for certain speeds. And if you exceed those speed thresholds, you could put the train and its cargo at risk. I was unfortunate enough to live in Aiken, South Carolina when we had one of the largest derailments in history. And that was the Graniteville incident where this chemical, heavy chemical, I forget its name, just exploded and went everywhere. Several folks lost their life, and it shut that track down for months, long time, and caused, I think it was a 2-mile radius of folks to have to abandon their homes. So it's not just the direct effect on the signaling on the track, on a train, maybe even its cargo, but think about the effects that it could have on the community, outside of.
Well, I think we just did that with one of the last derailments we had too. Didn't it have some type of a chemical load on it?
In Ohio.
In Ohio, and the residents were complaining, like it's in the air. That's air pollution because it burned for a long time. The chemical burned, being it put that solution in the air. So that's definitely a second, third, fourth order effect down the line. That's another problem.
Then the effect of that as well is if that train is derailed, all of those goods are either damaged or the supplies damaged, right?
And you're affecting people's pockets now.
And you're affecting people's pockets. And when I was down in Suffolk, right, the Norfolk area, you drive in, you see massive piles of coal,
absolutely,
right? Mass piles of coal, because that's the major port where coal leaves. A coal train shuts down or derails. That's a lot of coal. One, environmental disaster, but two, you now are losing all of that export that's there. That coal is probably going to take a while to get back on the cars, right? So
if it didn't burn,
right? So, the export factor and how it affects our, customers abroad, how it affects our allies, right, is also something to think about too. If you slow down a train, right, if one of those goods is supposed to get onto a ship, right, because everything's connected, that ship could be sitting there waiting for that item to come while all the other items on that ship are sitting there waiting, right? So you're now delaying the entire process.